all set to go? All right.
You can hear me too?
Yep, we're good, Cheryl. Well, everyone, thank you so much for returning here for our afternoon sessions for the Caring for People with Memory Loss Conference. It's been several years since I've actually spoken at this conference, even though, I'm technically the director of it, and I thought this year would be a good year to do so, and to really capture some of the thoughts I've been having about how we think about how we approach research and science for people living with dementia, their caregivers, et cetera. And so the title of this presentation is called Driving the Science Forward. But really the first part of this is not a presentation at all. It's going to be a conversation. And it's a conversation with a colleague I just cherish so much. It's Dr. Cheryl Robertson. Dr. Robertson, she is a professor in the School of Nursing. Her research and its nationally and internationally renowned body of work that focuses on conflict, trauma, dislocation, and recovery. Very, very important line of work. And, on a personal level, when I came here in 2005 at the University of Minnesota, I was in the School of Nursing from 2005 till 2018, and I'm not a nurse by training. And when I first came here, I had some trepidation about how I would fit into the culture of nursing as a developmental psychologist by training. And it was people like Cheryl, and in particular Cheryl, who really helped me feel welcome today. And I am just so privileged and honored that Cheryl is willing to share her story with us and the audience today. And so Cheryl, thank you. And we're just going to have a conversation here to start. And so Cheryl, why don't you start by telling us a little bit more about what brings you here today and what you'd like to share with us?
Hello, everyone. Well, I guess I'm here to talk a little bit about what's been going on with me lately, and, I used to feel super self-conscious about saying, hi, I'm Cheryl and I'm an alcoholic. And now that's nothing. Now I get to say, hi, I'm Cheryl and I have Alzheimer's. And that is super sobering, Joe, to say. And so I think it'll be really helpful for me and for folks in the audience to talk a little bit about what that experience has been like. Because not obviously, but I'm pretty recently diagnosed. And one thing, so we're sitting here in this beautiful room here in McNamara, and I've done a lot of presentations in McNamara. And the last one I did was a TED Talk. And so it was this really, it was a really cool experience. It's the only TED Talk I've done. So I really had, I just had a blast, and I invited all my friends, and it was super cool. And in my TED Talk, I got to talk about my adventures. And so this is an adventure of sorts that never occurred to me would be in my future, and it's pretty sobering. So, why am I here? I think that it's really helpful to be able to talk. And it's also an opportunity for me to reflect on the opportunities that I thought I had ahead of me, and instead what the opportunities may be that I do have ahead of me. And, I've spent most of my career, as have you, always looking at what the next big thing is. And now the next big thing feels really, really mysterious to me. So this all started a year ago last Christmas, so not last Christmas, the Christmas before. My kids were teasing me about repeating stories. Yeah. And I paid little attention to that, of course. But then about a month afterwards, I thought, maybe I should get that checked out. I went to see my primary care provider, a super cool nurse practitioner, and she said, oh, Cheryl, no, but she said, if you really want to explore, let's go to the someone here, a neurologist here at the U. And so I said, why not? What the heck? And at the very end, she did that sort of super quickie little mini mental exam. Yep. And unlike President Trump, I did not remember the words that were said to me. I didn't do well on that. And she said, oh, that's just because you're nervous. And so I convinced her it's because I'm nervous. But I did go see the neurologist. It was an incredibly negative experience, I'm sorry to say.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, basically, it was, he did that and some other testing, and it was just, this was just as the pandemic was coming into fray. So the whole, the whole scene was kind of odd as they were, just the beginning of wearing masks and that kind of stuff. And it was like a few days later, everything shut down. But I did a series of tests, but just, like just there in the office. It wasn't a very long meeting. He left and he came back and he said, well, we need to do some more testing, but it looks like you've got Alzheimer's. That's what I would guess.
Yeah.
And I was just like,
yeah,
what the hell? And then I went home and everything shut down. So the further fall testing and all that was, didn't happen.
Right.
So I was just
the pandemic.
because of the pandemic. Right. And so, Joe, I was just sitting there going, well, what do I do? And a friend of mine got me on the list at Mayo Clinic.
Okay, great.
And as soon as things started to open up, I got in. I guess they had a long list of people. Most people probably were far away. And so anyway, I got in right away. And I was there for 4 days. And of course, a much more holistic experience. A lot of, a lot of testing and the like, and super cool people. But the diagnosis came out the same, is early stage Alzheimer's. And I was, that wasn't good. And I was just sort of like, well, now what do I do? And I felt fine. I was teaching, I was doing, moving everything onto Zoom like the rest of the population. And it was just sort of in a state of shock. It was, and of course, with everything shutting down too,
right.
I was thinking like, oh, geez, I should get a therapist, but I didn't, but I just didn't even know where to begin.
Yeah, tell me more about some of the people around you that you connected with during this time, and how they helped you through it, or not.
Yeah, no, I had no negative experience. I mean, so it's like I told my friends, and friends being the cool people that they are. No. No, they're wrong. But I said, no, you guys, really, they're not wrong. That's been, my friends have been really cool in terms of like, how much do you want to talk about it? How much do you not want to talk about it? Most of my friends will do a pretty good job of saying something like, oh, yeah, Cheryl, we talked about that a couple days ago. It's like, oh, yeah, right. And so, they're pretty straight up with me. And my friends have been super cool. My kids, it's been really, really hard. My kids are young adults.
Yeah,
they're just launching their lives, Joe. I mean, they're from 29 to 34, 3 kids, young adults, and they have had a very, very hard time. And so I was just down in Tennessee with all 3 kids. My oldest son he and his wife just had a baby, so baptism down in Memphis.
Yeah.
And that was the first time that we talked at the all of us together, because my kids live in 3 different states. And it was better, but boy, they don't ask questions. I think they're really scared, and I think that there's a way that they still need me. I mean, they don't. I mean, they're these kids are 3 kids that are doing well. So when I say need me, I don't mean on a regular basis, But they're young adults, and I think they're not ready for this, and I feel awful about that.
Yeah.
I feel awful about that. I mean, I had the coolest relationship with my parents up until the day they both died.
Yeah.
And they didn't have memory loss. And so and that, I'd like to have that with my kids,
Right.
but I won't.
Right. Well, do you feel like, your relationship with your kids has changed demonstrably, or what do you?
Well, that's a good question. It's just a topic we don't talk about.
Sure. Sure.
And so it's and it would be good for me, I think, to get some good guidance on like how much to just let that sit there
Mm-hmm.
and wait for them, or I mean, we've had some conversations. Like the first thing I did after getting diagnosed was I thought, oh shoot, I should get a will. Like I
Yeah,
never
sure,
had a
yes,
will,
yeah, right, plan.
and an advance directive, that kind of stuff. And so I did that, and and so I had to do some talking with them about that. But in general, I feel like I've had much more sort of honest and soul-seeking conversations with dear friends.
Okay, good.
Than with my kids, and that is something that I'm going to need to sort of figure out as we go forward.
Yeah, no. We had talked a little bit before in preparing for this about stigma. And so tell me about, how you feel about potential stigmatization in this situation.
Well, sort of how I started out the conversation saying, it's like, hi, I'm Cheryl, I'm an alcoholic. Well, that always felt a little awkward, but actually, in Minnesota, not very, I mean, it's kind of garden variety, but to say, I have Alzheimer's, that feels really bad. And like I was saying to you before class, I just finished teaching Public Health Institute class. I teach a class on war and public health, and it's my favorite class. I've been teaching it forever.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
But then I think, one of my students knew that I had Alzheimer's. Like, what the heck? And so, in some ways,
and maybe the question to ask is, so what? I mean, it clearly hasn't impacted or influenced your ability
not
to excel
to teach.
as a researcher.
So far, so
clearly,
good. Yeah.
So
So far, so
just gave a
good.
TED talk. So
Well,
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, true. Right. And I think that my fear is that I might not know if it was like maybe, yeah, right. I mean, I've always been pretty self-confident, and I just sort of march into any situation.
That's true.
And, and this feels like, well, maybe I don't know maybe I don't know how I'm coming off. Maybe I don't know that maybe I am sounding unclear. It's like that sort of self-confidence.
So self-consciousness, or like be a little more self-conscious about what you're
self-conscious and sort of less self-confidence.
Yes,
and,
yes.
What if I got lost? What if, things that I just never thought about before.
Right, right.
Yeah.
What would you tell others who, let's say, are working with someone, know someone very well, close to someone who are going through your experience? I mean, what would you really want them to know?
Wow. First of all, I guess to sort of meet people at the level they're at, and not have assumptions. And there's, this is kind of a weird way to answer that, but I was at a retirement party night before last.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, that means there's old people there. And so the conversation started going on about, the afflictions the old people get, as we do. And so two people started talking about friends of theirs that are caregivers of spouses with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And of course, their descriptions of it, that it was living hell.
Yeah.
And that their lives are just over because this is what they're doing now, and just sort of shaking the heads and, and just like, oh God. And that's the narrative. And I don't think that's a dishonest narrative. I mean, I haven't cared for somebody with Alzheimer's, but we've got to do a better job with the narrative in terms of, either helping things be easier for people who are caring for folks, and giving them the kind of support, because it's like these folks at this party were talking about just the level of isolation for the people who were caregivers, and their own sort of loneliness and despair. And my thinking was, well, that's something we could do something about. It's not my area of research, Joe. This is yours,
Right.
but I mean, but my bet is that there's something we can do about that, and to somehow. There's a lot of people getting old now. I think there's going to be a lot of folks with this diagnosis, and we've got to change the narrative from it being just this sort of living hellhole.
Yes, yes.
And this sort of life of despair and despondency. I mean, all these things that I'm sort of looking forward to. You know, it's just that looking for, you know, that at some point my life is going to be living hell. We got to do something about that.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense.
Right.
It makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Yeah, especially how we research these topics.
How we research these topics, because I don't have any doubt that these caregivers are having a really hard time.
Yes.
They're all cool people. These are people I know. There could be services out there, supports out there, so that it wasn't living hell.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So what, you know, and you covered this a little bit already, but what has been the hardest part about sharing your diagnosis with others, friends, family, you know, coworkers?
It is so far from how I saw myself.
Yeah.
You have heard me say, and my friends, and for people that don't know me, but I've always said the way I want to die is I want to take a bullet to the head in the Congo, in Eastern Congo. For people in the audience, they won't understand that. But
Yeah, maybe, yeah. So Dr. Robinson's work, much of her work has been conducted in Africa.
Yeah.
She's traveled there very frequently and has conducted very important work in
Well,
those communities. Yeah.
Well, my work, most of my work has been in conflict zones, and I've been doing that since I was really pretty young. And first of all, in the world of the NGO world and that, and then later in the world of, you know, I used to run the international programs at the Center for Victims of Torture. So, you know, so that's kind of been my scene. And so I always thought the way I want to die is die quick. And yeah, take a bullet in Eastern Congo. So in other words, I'm doing exactly what I love, and boom, party over. Well, that doesn't look like that's going to happen. I mean, it could, but less likely. And and so I think that in terms of, you know, so those are my fears of like that. At this point in my life, things are okay, but at some point they won't be, and that's absolutely abjectly terrifying.
Yeah.
That I won't have control over, you know, my world. That's terrifying.
Right. And so that really is maybe your biggest fear.
That's totally my biggest fears is, you know, is just not being able to, yeah. And being a burden to my kids, to my friends, people saying like, oh shit, I've got to go see her. You know, it's just like, geez.
Yeah.
That's just, like I said, rather take a bullet in Eastern Congo. Right.
So what is the most helpful thing? You kind of talked about this already. What is the most helpful thing you think families and friends can do?
Well, for example, okay, I've been doing
professionals too.
Yeah,
Should add
right.
them in as well.
So I've been doing the Bredesen diet, the classic anti-inflammatory diet,
good.
And no soy, no gluten, no dairy, which that's kind of limiting. And so it's like, I'd say half the people in my life say, oh, come on, you know, you don't need to do that. And it's like, well, first of all, there's nothing out there for us. There's very few resources out there for folks with Alzheimer's. You know, it's like, which just still shocks me. But you know, so it's like, well, if diet is one of the things that can help, then you bet I'm going to do it. And the other thing is, I'm really exercising a lot. I'm doing a lot of aerobic exercise. I got a trainer now.
Oh, that's great, Cheryl. That's excellent. Yeah.
And so,
and I know you used to like riding your bicycle.
I still ride. Ride my bike all year long, and I just got a new bike up north we could talk about. But anyway, and so things that people can do that are helpful is to be really supportive of that stuff rather than trying to talk me out of it. And but I think most of the, I mean, the vast majority of time is just that I still like to do the same things and hang out with the same folks and watch the same movies and go out to the same restaurants now that we can actually do that again. I went to my first movie last night.
Okay,
It's
good,
like,
good,
and,
yeah.
you know, and just keep doing, you know, hope folks just keep engaging me in all the things that, I've already liked to do, you know, and not, assume that, you know, I don't want to do those things anymore. Not assume that I just don't want to take long bike rides anymore. That kind of thing.
Right,
Yeah,
right, right.
Yeah. So, in other words, I guess just kind of normalize the whole thing is like we would with anybody that gets some lousy diagnosis. You know, yeah. There's no shortage of lousy diagnoses that humans can get, and lots of people get them. And I suspect that most of us just want to just keep on doing what we do for as long as we can and not have it be the centerpiece of conversation, to not have it be something we can't talk about, and not have it be something that is, you know, that would be the first thing people think of when they see me. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Right.
You know, it comes back to me, I think, to this whole issue of labeling. You know, and it's interesting, Cheryl, you know, when you shared this news with me, I mean, it's not a positive thing. I mean, we all know this, but I mean, honestly, I don't think of you any differently. Like, I wouldn't hesitate for a second. I mean, you're speaking here. If I was doing some like lecture in a class on a topic related to the work you do, I'd have you in a heartbeat. I mean, it's just not relevant to me, I don't think. I mean, but I think for a lot of other people it is. I mean, they have this.
Right. I mean, you have a sophisticated understanding
I
of
think
this.
so.
Right.
I mean, I don't know.
But that's not where, you know, right. But that's not where a lot of people are. They hear the word and it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one thing, you know, you are certainly doing it today. We've also had other examples at this conference in the past where, you know, people with this diagnosis, I mean, they are showing us the way and examples of doing exactly like you said, continuing to do what you still like to do, what you prefer to do, and not necessarily having to be significantly limited until you have to. I mean, but then, you know, you know, it's as much on other people around you to adjust appropriately and to create, you know, environments and situations for, you know, anyone living with memory loss to thrive, versus the person having to feel like I'm going to be a burden, you know, having that fear. I mean, that's where we have to get as a society, I think. And we have a long way to go. There's no doubt about it. So, and the pandemic showed us that, I think. But,
yeah, no doubt. And so a conversation I had with you earlier is I was saying, how come there isn't like some kind of, you know, cool advocacy group or whatever for folks with Alzheimer's? You know, there's advocacy groups for everyone else. And then you said there are.
There are, yeah.
And I just had no idea. And how would I have known that if I didn't talk to you? I mean, like I would have had no idea.
Yeah, there's quite a few of them. I mean, there's certainly the Alzheimer's Association itself has certain elements of, you know, at least interest groups and advisory boards of people living with dementia. But there are other organizations too that, you know, are even maybe more vocal. The Dementia Action Alliance is one out of DC. I've come into contact with them several times.
Are they feisty?
They're very feisty. You're going to hear about them in a second.
Feisty is good.
They engaging with them actually led me to come up with this topic today, of driving the science forward and kind of, you know, making sure we keep the voice of the person living with dementia in our research. And the Dementia Action Alliance is a good example. Us Against Alzheimer's is another very, I think, vocal, strong advocacy group as well. So I think those two working alongside the Alzheimer's Association, now they don't always agree, of course.
Yeah, well,
but
that's cool.
But
sure.
that's advocacy.
Yeah, right. That's right.
I mean,
exactly.
The Dementia Action Alliance in particular, and, you know, I'll connect you with them again after our presentation today, because you would like them actually. I think you'd fit right in with them.
See, that sounds really, really cool. So,
and I respect them a great deal for what they do. So, yeah.
My son is getting his MPH, and so he's doing his final paper. He's doing research on ACT UP. You remember ACT UP,
yes,
right?
Yes,
and for HIV/AIDS, and which is all weird to me to think that that's considered history. You know, it's like, wasn't that just yesterday? But anyway, but anyway, and so, you know, he said to me, he said, I should have an ACT UP for Alzheimer's, and I said, yeah, you know, it's like, all right.
They do. I mean,
Yeah,
I
right,
think in a
exactly.
way,
That's what I'm hearing.
probably
Yeah.
not, not as
Well, they're not in the streets.
demonstrative as ACT
Yeah.
UP was,
Well,
for
we're older.
real
We're
reasons,
older.
I think. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, no, there are this Dementia Action Alliance is a good example where they they are very regularly present in DC at various type of summits that have been happening.
Mhm.
In the last 10 years, there's been a large influx of federal funding to better support Alzheimer's research, which is a very positive thing, I think. And along with that have been a number of summits, reports about the state of the science of dementia and dementia care. What do we need to do to move forward? And, to the credit of many federal agencies, they're including stakeholder voices, and those voices include people living with dementia. So the Dementia Action Alliance is often there expressing their opinion, their valued opinion in many ways. And I think a big thing is in labeling terminology. Stigma has come up many times. And what's interesting, I would argue, is America is actually a little bit behind the UK and Europe in this regard, in that there is a more institutionalized movement to ensuring that research that's done with people living with dementia also make sure that there's approval from the community of people living with dementia and their caregivers of what is this work and how is it to be created and achieved. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next part of my presentation. But no, this has been wonderful, Cheryl. I have a couple of things I'd like to ask our attendants here today. First is if you have questions for Cheryl, certainly for myself as well, we would be happy to answer those, and I'm going to pull them up on my phone because Robin and others have been kind enough to provide those. So let me share with you a couple of the questions, comments we've had, Cheryl. They're really good, actually. So first comment, how courageous you are, and I agree 100%. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you so much for being here. Have you read Sanjay Gupta's new book, Keep Sharp, Build a Better Brain at Any Age? 5 Pillars of the Brain by moving, by discovering, by nourishing, by relaxing, and connecting with other persons. So that sounds like a very interesting resource there.
Well,
and
I will,
yeah,
because I like Sanjay Gupta,
yeah,
so sure.
Yeah, check that out.
All right.
That sounds like good. Thank you for who shared that. Now here's some questions, and let's talk about some of these. So here's the first question. How will you live your life or plan differently because of this?
How will I live my, well, I think I had assumed I would just stay in my little house forever. And the fact that I don't have a bathroom on the main floor has never bothered me because I'm super fit. And so with my dog and cat and so I'm starting to get educated about, places to live where the graduated independent, and all the way down to, full care. That's the kind of thing that I just never really thought about thinking about. And I'm in a couple weeks, I have an appointment with an elder law attorney to learn about like what I should be doing with retirement funds and that kind of stuff in terms of related to the costs of care. Oh shoot, I would never have thought of that in a gazillion years. And never. It's just like, again, that take a bullet in the Congo mentality. Why would I need to think about that? I think so at this moment in time, I don't do anything different, but I'm spending a lot of time spinning around in my head about what I might need to be doing. And some of that is healthy and some of that can get into weird sort of unpleasant thinking too. My mind can go to some pretty unpleasant places. Right. And so how to keep myself thinking about strategically, this is what I should be doing, and not go down just a really rabbit hole of despair. That's a balance. I think that's hard.
Okay. Thank you. So what factors go into deciding how to share this diagnosis with your students, workers? So why did you decide to share this with us, with me, with our audience here today? I mean, tell us why?
Because I felt so damned ashamed.
Yeah.
And you and I talked about this. I mean, I was thinking, after I got the diagnosis, I was trying to think, I couldn't think of anything I could feel more ashamed about. It's like, what the heck? I mean, and, and I do think that and as a recovering person, who went through drug and alcohol treatment, there's a, there is this sort of sense of, diagnoses we can get that we end up feeling ashamed about. But I think that, substance use disorder is so much part of sort of the lexicon today that it's kind of lost a lot of that stigma. And, people that have been sober for a long time, just like, where this still feels, it's embarrassing. How can it feels embarrassing. It's like, if I told you that, if I was to come up to you and say, Joe, I've got a cancer diagnosis, that also would be really scary. The other thing is that, how do I say this? There's no hope. There's nothing on the horizon for this, which that just baffles me. Like, what the heck? How could it be 2021 and there's like, and the only drug they can offer me is Aricept? I mean, that's like, what the hell? Like, I mean, there's a lot of people working on this, and so that sense of sort of hopelessness, where with other diagnoses, not all of them, obviously, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's lots of horrible things to get. So, I mean, I'm not in any way sort of saying, making value judgment, but on a lot of diagnoses, there's at least hope. There's something around the corner. There's new things to try, this and that. And it's like, if my biggest hope is, not eating gluten and hiring a trainer, I mean, that feels pretty limited.
Right. It's interesting too, you contrast this with the cancer diagnosis, and that, of course, is seen as negative by many people. At the same time though, and like in our mind, when you think of the person with the cancer diagnosis, and at least in my mind, the image that often comes up then is the cancer survivor, they're doing, the run and all of that, and everything. Whereas
and we know that's not always the case. I mean, in no way do I want to suggest that like one is worse. I mean, my God.
No, but but the thing is I think when people, the mind of the Alzheimer's diagnosis or dementia, or even mild cognitive impairment, it's hopeless.
It's hopeless,
and
it's awful for other people too.
That's right.
It'll be an awful experience for me, and it'll be an awful experience for the people that love me.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting, Cheryl, is number one, I don't think that reflects the full experience of people living with dementia. I mean, we hear it over and over that's not necessarily how people living with dementia see themselves. And the downside of that thinking too is not only does it affect people living with dementia, I think it really does affect the type of care that's delivered. This idea that, well, there's nothing we can do about dementia. Why should we diagnose it? Or, why do we need to do anything? And again, I don't think that isn't the case, but it's that stigma that I think dictates how we think about and view Alzheimer's and dementia, how we treat it, and, how we do our research on it. So.
And the stigma thing is interesting because we have, I mean, how's this for a profound statement? It's like, we have stigma about weird things. How's that? But I mean, it's like there's sort of honorable diseases and dishonorable diseases or something. And it's just like, what the heck? Right.
Interesting comment that just came through. And again, this is why I love having our audience and interact, because they have so much knowledge of what's going on out there. And so in St. Paul, organized through the Alzheimer's Association, we had Rally Day, where we met with local politicians, and also some people went to Washington advocating that more money goes to research. And actually that worked, by the way, for those of you that were involved, that has worked. And reminding, again, politicians in Washington how many people are affected, especially as the population ages, and also the influence on caregivers, particularly caregivers who have to leave the workplace after their loved ones. So this is an example of grassroots advocacy going to policymakers. And again, this has worked.
And I want to get more involved in that.
So, and for those of you online or who are attending here, feel free to keep putting these in through the comments, and we're going to compile these and share them, obviously not just with Cheryl, but with everybody. Also, there's happy recent news on successful research on dementia medications that a psychiatrist could comment on now. I'm not sure if this is what this comment is referring to, but there has been, there has been a third potential medication that has been under review by the FDA. you know,
I think I read about that.
yeah, and so it's been, you know, that's a more that's an interesting. The advocacy organizations like Us on Against Alzheimer's is very much pushing for this to be approved to give people another option.
Even though it's
Its
questionable,
efficacy is
right,
kind of
right,
questionable.
right.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of where that's at right now. But yes, again, that's another example though where advocacy organizations are throwing their weight around, quite frankly. Question here, and I could try to maybe take this one. Have any studies been done linking alcoholism and dementia? My grandfather had Alzheimer's and he also was an alcoholic. That's a really good question. You know, remember, Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia. Dementia and Alzheimer's aren't the same thing. Alzheimer's is a disease. Dementia is a cluster of symptoms that are diagnosed. And so Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. What dementia is negative, basically a neurological disease leads to dementia. And what dementia is negative changes in thinking, memory, in some cases behavior that impact one's ability to live independently. And so Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia symptoms, but it's not the only type or cause. Parkinson's is one type of dementia, vascular dementia is another, Lewy body disease, etc. There is a type of dementia, it's fairly rare, that is linked to very severe alcohol abuse, and that's Korsakoff syndrome.
Yes, right.
But in large, in terms of epidemiological research that has linked alcoholism with dementia onset or Alzheimer's, there hasn't been a clear direct link to that. There certainly has been some research suggesting the Mediterranean diet with, very moderate intakes of, say, red wine might be protective from a brain health standpoint. But people who overindulge in alcohol, I mean, the way to think of it is this way. Even though there might not necessarily be a direct link, we know that people who overindulge in alcohol are also often engaging in other unhealthy lifestyle behaviors that then can impact brain health. For example, people who overindulge in alcohol might also be obese. They might basically not engage in reducing certain types of cardiovascular risk factors that then are linked to potential dementia. So that's probably the way to think of alcoholism, or really a number of other unhealthy lifestyle behaviors and they're linked to Alzheimer's, if that makes sense. So, yeah. Cheryl, what else would you like to share with us today that you think we need to think about?
Let's see here. I've got my notes here. I think we've covered most of those. I think this is a cool conversation.
Yeah,
and it's really fun to see the questions and stuff that people are asking.
Great.
And it feels exciting, the possibility of getting involved with advocacy groups. That suits my nature. That suits my personality.
Very much, yes.
That's true. That suits my personality. Yes. And I guess I should have known that there would be, that there would be advocacy groups for this. It's just hasn't been my world.
Right.
Alzheimer's is something that, to be honest, I've probably said the word 5 times in my life before this. It just wasn't. It hasn't been part of my family. It hasn't been part of my reality.
Right. And one thing is, and we'll get to some more comments and questions here, is this event is something that I would love for you to come back to each year, because I think what you'll find, particularly when we start meeting again next year, there's a lot of people in the audience who are going through this journey, not just care providers and professionals, people living with memory loss are in the audience, and I think you
see, and that's really cool to know. How many people are here? Well, how many people are at this?
Well, today, it's interesting for those of you that are on, and we had over 500 people register, which is by far more than we've ever had for any conference of this kind. But there aren't as many people attending. There's maybe 150 to 200 attending, which is low for us compared to when we have an in-person event. I think part of it is people are either zoomed out, or people who registered know that we're going to send them the recording. They can watch it later.
See, and I think the fact that there's 200 people that are interested, see, again, this is your world. So therefore you would know that there's 200 people interested in this. This is not my world.
Yes.
Well, it is now, but it hasn't been. And so it would never have occurred to me. If you had said there were 25 people here, I would have thought, oh, cool, good turnout. So.
No, it's interesting. Like 150 for us is, if this was an in-person event, 150 people, it would be on the low side.
So I'm just like, who knew that 150 people would be interested? In other words, I've got a lot to learn in terms of what's happening outside of my own little world with this. And the idea that there's advocacy to be a part of is terribly exciting.
Great. And so another comment came into that effect. We talked about the Dementia Action Alliance. And again, I mean, I might very well,
I'm not writing these down,
and
but
that's okay.
you'll,
We'll save these, and I might very well after I'll connect you with someone that I know there. Also, there's another organization called Dementia Mentors, dementiamentors.org. That's recommended as something else to check out. That sounds interesting too.
Yeah, right.
So that's great. Thank you for those of you sharing that out there. Here's another question for you, Cheryl. Thank you for sharing your personal experience. Can you speak a little more about the process of getting diagnosed? Did you seek out memory clinics in the area before going to Mayo? So I think the latter question is yes, you came here to the university.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, speak a little bit more about the process of getting diagnosed, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, it started out with just doing that mini mental exam.
Yeah.
And where I had the provider here say, you know, like, ah, looks like Alzheimer's. Well, see you around. I mean, it wasn't quite that flippant, but yeah. So at Mayo, it was 4 days worth of testing. One day was spent, there was 6 hours, which was a
very long,
horrible
very
thing
intensive, yeah.
of questions. And I just went for my follow-up. So I've had 2, and that was really, and just every kind of sort of mental test, that's not the right word, but every kind of,
right.
You know,
yes.
test you could imagine, long and grueling. And there are lots of different types of brain scans. I did a lumbar puncture, which was that was the defining, that was actually the defining thing where,
right.
Again, you know, the last day they did a lumbar puncture, and then of course it comes up on my chart, you know, 10 days later. And so, you know, it's 10 o'clock at night, and I open up my chart and there's a thing that says diagnosis, Alzheimer's. And I'm like, shoot.
We can edit that out.
And, you know, I didn't sleep well that night, you know, and, you know, but so in other words, lots of different, with different types of care providers. There's a coordinating nurse there.
Good.
Who is awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
She's just awesome. And so she would meet me at the end of each day and, oh, how's it been going? And recommended cool books and that kind of stuff. And so kind of holding it all together, a really super cool role. And so that was pretty cool.
No, that sounds great, Cheryl.
Yep.
That sounds wonderful.
Boy, that day of testing though.
Yeah, and I think there was a follow-up question to that effect. You know, what types of tests did you get for the physician to diagnose your Alzheimer's? You've talked about some of that already here. So this is really a great question here, this next one. How has your professional work on trauma and resilience helped you at all as you have faced your Alzheimer's diagnosis? Great question.
God, that's the best.
Yeah, that's
I wish I thought of that. So allow me to sound petulant and uncool.
Yeah, that's fine.
Which, well, it's only 200 people.
Yeah.
I can go into, this is not impressive, Joe. I can go into a place of like, this is, well, okay, I'll just say it, where it's like, well, those guys have hope. And I don't. I mean, that is really small. I mean, it's not impressive, folks. However, but when I step out of that, which fortunately I can. I mean, when I talk about that kind of you know, sort of small behavior, I don't live there. But I would be a liar. I would be a liar if I didn't say it didn't come in there.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It makes total sense.
So I mean, it's not where I just sit all the time, for God's sake. So that would be unbearable. Yeah. But it does come in there. But actually, I think that there's a lot of value in that. In that, my line is always, we are a very hardy species. And in my years of working, so. I tell a story, and I'll repeat it here, that I tell often at the Center for Victims of Torture, and I don't know why this story always comes back to me, but we had a client who we were seeing who had, she was by herself. She had lost her family, her husband, and all of her children had been killed. She was here completely by herself, and she had suffered horribly. Yeah. And she was getting services at CVT, and like 5 years later, I'm in Target, and this woman comes up to me and taps me on the shoulder and says, Cheryl. and she was pushing the red cart. She had a handsome young man with her, a toddler in the cart, and a cart full of all the stuff that one needs for a family. And I just had this sense of like, oh my God, she did the complete do-over. This is a woman who lost everything, and little by little, she didn't just one day get up and dust herself off and say, okay, I'm going to do life again.
Yeah.
It's just that sort of incremental stuff of how one, and suddenly here I am seeing her 4 years later, 5 years later, and she has rebuilt a life. But of course, for her, that process, of course, was incremental. And it was a wonderful experience. And so, in other words, our capacity to heal is just amazing, is mind-boggling to me. And my work at the center really taught me that. And my work in communities that have suffered horribly has taught me that. And I think that there is, in my better moments, I think about how I want to be with this, and what kind of person I want to be with this, and how I want to be. There's no way that I'm always going to be brave and that I'm always going to be cool, because that's not the case. The scariest part is for when I don't have control over how I am. That's really scary for me. But until then, I'd like to be. I'd like to be somebody who, continues to look for resources and continues to try to, build. And because we are a hardy species, and this is something that I just, took me by storm. But I would like to do it in a mildly classy way, if that's possible. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of
mildly
sense.
classy, if possible.
That sounds really good. That's wonderful. Let's go to another question here. I find it interesting that loss of control is the biggest worry. I've been a strong advocate for people being able to stay in control of driving cessation decisions, stopping driving. What are you planning on doing regarding the decision of when it is not safe anymore to drive? Are you aware of advanced directives for driving cessation? Has the conversation come up with your neurologist? So that's kind of an interesting set of questions.
So it hasn't come up. I don't know anything about, what do you call it? Driving cessation?
Driving cessation, so stopping driving.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I have a beater of a car, 2009 car, that I thought probably time to think about it. It's a rear wheel drive, so it's terrible for Minnesota, so I'm stuck all the time. Yeah. And so it occurred to me not too long ago that, like, God, I shouldn't buy a new car. Like what, because I won't be driving that long. Maybe I can make this thing last. And, I've always been a lousy driver, and and so I think, but I've thought about. I mean, it's a good question, because I've thought about it a lot. Like, should I be driving now? I think so, but I've got a cross country trip planned with a friend, a couple of friends for later in the summer, and I'll be, her and I will be sharing driving, and and it's like, it's a good question, because I don't know the answer. Like, would I be the one to know that it's time to stop? I mean, my dad didn't know when it was time to stop driving. He didn't have memory loss, but he had a lot of other things, and it was a huge issue for me and my brother, and to try to get him to stop driving. So I don't want to be that person. At the same time, I don't want to stop driving before I have to. So I mean, it's a good question. I don't know the answer.
So it's a really good question. So see if we have any other questions or comments here. And I think that might be it, Cheryl. So if others have questions for Cheryl here, I mean, again, we'll field them. Otherwise, I think we'll transition to my presentation. But, I just want to thank you so much, Cheryl.
Was this helpful?
I mean, Cheryl, it was incredible. I mean, it meant so much to me. I've learned so much. And, I think, again, I want to emphasize, Cheryl, I mean, this is a community you can come back to and feel part of, because you are part of it. I mean, I think in the end, when I introduced the conference, for those of you that were on this morning, I mean, it was kind of for that reason. It was to build this community that people felt comfortable coming back to year after year after year, because of the people they met, the resources they get, and everything. So I just so appreciate it, Cheryl. Thank you. Thank you for everything you've meant to me over the years. And again, thank you for this wonderful conversation. So give me a big hug too.
Oh my God, we can do that.
Yeah,
now.
I think so.
Oh my
Yeah.
God.
Yes, so
Well,
thanks,
totally
Cheryl.
liberating.
Yes, isn't that
Right.
nice? So that's
Right.
good.
So,
So,
you know, this was really fun.
good, Cheryl.
I mean, I'll do this anytime.
Oh, well,
you
we
know.
appreciate that
Yeah.
very much. We hope to, and I, again, really would love for you to come back, Cheryl. So,
Oh,
yeah, come back to the
absolutely,
conference.
absolutely.
Okay, so I am transitioning over to the presentation here. And so, everyone, the reason why I really wanted Dr. Robertson, Cheryl, to present here, number one, because I've known what a tremendous speaker she is and how engaging she is and how important this was. And I felt like it was the ideal setup for this part of the presentation, which will be brief, but talking about some thinking I've been doing, and a lot of this has been driven by the conference, quite frankly, and talking with many of you, is how do we make sure we keep the voices of people living with dementia as well as their caregivers in our research and our science. And you know, you just heard a very powerful voice talk about their experiences living with dementia. And from the standpoint of researchers, those of us in science, how do we ensure we ensure those voices remain front and center in the work we do? And so this whole second part of my talk is really thinking on my part of how do I ensure, number one, I reflect a lot of my own work in this present about how my work can move in this direction. But then also in general, how can we ensure that our science moves in this direction? So I'm going to, oh, here we go. Clicker. Trying to get to the next slide. Okay, great. So here are our objectives here today. The first is, as I just mentioned, to how to better incorporate the voice of people living with dementia and caregivers in our work. A lot of this is coming from a paper that we wrote a couple of years ago that appeared in Alzheimer's and Dementia, Translational Research and Clinical Interventions. It was really focusing on how do we reconsider frameworks of how we think about Alzheimer's and dementia incorporated in our work. This is actually a freely available text. If anyone is interested in downloading it and reading it in full, again, you have the link here to access that. So, dementia research really has not consistently included people living with dementia and their caregivers. And as I was talking about with Cheryl, you know, the last several years, again, there's been a large investment in Alzheimer's research on the part of various federal agencies, most prominently the National Institutes of Health through the National Institute on Aging. And as part of this investment, there have been a number of national summits convened to really consider what is the state of the science of dementia, and more importantly, how do we move forward? And as I had mentioned, as part of these summits, various stakeholders were invited to provide their own insights, advocacy organizations like the Alzheimer's Association, but then also other organizations such as the Dementia Action Alliance, people living with dementia themselves. And one of the things that was very apparent to me when I attended and in some cases spoke at these summits was that, you know, many of these advocates would stand up and go to the mic and they would sit, you know, and the sentiment really was, you know, this terminology you're using doesn't capture my experience. You know, it is challenging to live with memory loss and dementia, but my life isn't all negative. I can still do things. I still have a voice. I still have preferences. Why isn't it that reflected in all of this science that's being presented here to us today? And that really resonated with me, perhaps even more so than some of the presentations by many of the august speakers at these summits and conferences, in that, number one, is there value in incorporating these voices in our research? And I would argue very much yes, it's very important, in part because I think by doing that, it helps us better meet the needs of the day-to-day experiences of people living with dementia and their carers. And then number two, considering more generally how our science can be influenced by this perspective. So that's really where this talk, this idea came through, this driving the science forward. So research that emphasizes the potential for growth and resilience during dementia is valuable and necessary. And the reason why is, and a lot of this was reflected in what we just talked about in that great conversation with Dr. Robertson. It can reduce stigma, again, by emphasizing the full experience of people living with dementia, not just the decline, that can potentially happen. It can improve quality of life, and importantly, focus on what does quality of life mean in dementia. It can encourage innovative interventions, and what I mean by that is this. And I'm guilty and complicit of this myself, is many of the interventions and programs that we might develop and evaluate to support people living with dementia and their caregivers tends to be based around negative outcomes. How do we reduce stress? How do we reduce quote unquote behavior problems in the person living with dementia? So really that we really rely on this constellation of negative outcomes when determining does a certain intervention work or not, and sometimes that also dictates the actual content of the intervention itself. But by approaching growth and resilience in dementia and incorporating that in interventions, it really helps us focus on strength-based perspectives, focusing on interventions that revolve around how can we maximize what people can still do while they're living with dementia. And again, that came out in this conversation with Dr. Robertson, focusing on, things she's still doing. She still has a vibrant, intellectually, socially rich life. How do we make sure we maintain that in the context of living with dementia? Okay. And then finally, more effectively engaging with those who are living such experiences routinely. There's a real risk, I think, if we continue doing research through traditional paradigms, traditional frameworks, that in fact, we no longer create science and research that resonates with the day-to-day lives of the people that we're purporting to be quote unquote helping or working with. So again, these are the reasons why I think we need a reset to some extent. I mean, I've used the term flipping the script in some ways, of thinking of how we can approach Alzheimer's and dementia from a strengths-based perspective. And again, having that influence our work substantively, not just giving lip service to it. And quite frankly, I'm guilty of that. I think I am giving a lot of lip service to it because I still have to make that shift in my own work. And again, I'm using this talk, these conversations to hopefully move in that direction. So what are some some biases? So I mean, again, and this really is reflected in my own biases sometimes, unconsciously often, is even those of us interested in psychosocial aspects of dementia and dementia care, that certainly is someone like me, we focus solely on these assumptions of decline and loss. So again, the terminology often used in the literature, and we've had talks to this on this issue at this conference in the past, for example, how we classify behaviors. In the past, we used to call it behavior problems. Clinically, you'll see it called behavioral and psychiatric disturbances. And oftentimes, many people living with dementia and their caregivers react very negatively to that type of labeling, because it's felt that, in fact, these behaviors are more of an expression, say, of environmental stimuli or other interactions that, if we focus so much on these being negative outbursts, it may preclude us from actually finding an effective solution to, if not alleviate or stop a certain behavior, ensure that the person who's expressing that behavior ends up having positive emotional affect as a result. Okay. Same thing with caregiver studies, where again, the main outcomes traditionally, and they remain this way, are outcomes like caregiving stress, burden or feeling overwhelmed with the care situation, and depression. These tend to be by and large the main focus of many interventions for dementia caregivers. And again, does that necessarily capture the full experience of caregivers? I mean, we talk and hear from many caregivers, and they share things that are like, it was a challenging situation, but I'm glad I did it. I mean, I got very much a sense of purpose out of being a caregiver, providing care to a loved one with dementia. But again, that is rarely captured in our research, what we measure, our outcomes, et cetera. And I think that's a major gap. So this figure here is one example in the science of gerontology of moving beyond kind of this negative bias, this focus on decline. If you look at the discipline of gerontology itself, which again has been around really for the past 60 to 70 years or so, the whole point of gerontology, I would argue, as a science, as a discipline, was to fight against ageist attitudes in the medical profession, in society, of that older persons can no longer contribute to society, older person and old age, it's normal to experience disease and decline as we get older. The whole point of gerontology and these types of theoretical frameworks like successful aging focus on what we can do to optimize our lives as we get older. And I wanted to present this here because even though this framework has been around now for, gosh, it's almost 28 years or so and has been refined over time, it hasn't necessarily been successfully applied, I would argue, in dementia and dementia research itself, which still is predominantly focused, I would argue, through a biomedical lens. Again, Alzheimer's is a disease, which it is. I mean, it's a pathology, and, you know, like you heard in our conversation with Cheryl, it's nothing can be done about it. And looking and going back to our roots as gerontologists, I think we can find frameworks that might help us better inform the type of work we're doing. And so successful aging is one example. So there are issues with the successful aging paradigm, and I don't think I'm going to go in depth in these too much, is that, you know, when we think of successful aging and optimal aging, one of the problems with the framework, to some extent anyway, has been that it's very much a westernized framework. And does it actually apply across cultures, across contexts? And certainly with the diversification of older persons in this country, it's important to understand and know what constitutes quote unquote success or optimal aging in different contexts. And this would extend to dementia as well. And you heard again earlier today, I'm glad we've had these wonderful presentations on the African Immigrant Memory Loss Project, or the African Memory Loss Project, which really again, opens our eyes to how dementia is perceived in those communities. And then also, you know, what are some of the, I don't know if the term is correct here, but cultural labels that we ascribe to dementia. And what does that mean in terms of how do we develop education, resources, and again, science in these contexts? You know, another area I think requires more attention in dementia and is an exciting one is resilience. And Dr. Robertson, in her work with trauma and you know, conflict, war-torn countries, you know, resilience has been a core concept that has been focused upon in that work. In dementia, however, resilience as a concept, certainly resilience at a psychosocial level, hasn't necessarily been incorporated. And so when we look at other disciplines, for example, child development, resilience has been a topic of great attention. And one of the world's foremost scholars in resilience in child development is here at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Ann Maston, and that's a definition of resilience. And when we look at resilience, there's a couple of different and interesting ways we can consider doing that in dementia. One is how factors account for positive outcomes, where there's high risk for adversity. And then the second approach, and I like the second approach personally myself, where identifying or categorizing resilient individuals to examine how they differ from those with worse outcomes. And actually, our team did some work to this effect around 15 years ago on dementia caregivers, and we used a very large sample to do this. And it was a really interesting piece of work. People still talk to me about this work. I haven't picked it up since, but you know, the more I think about it, and I guess as an impetus for this talk, it's leading me more to think about, perhaps I should pick up this line of work. And so in this particular study, we actually had involved, it was a large secondary data set of caregivers from throughout the US, a little bit under 2,000 of them. And we followed them, the data followed them for 3 years. So we had a lot of good data on a big sample, a longitudinal data set. And what we decided to do in this particular study is classify dementia caregivers into one of two resilience categories. A category we call high resilience. So these were caregivers who were caring for loved ones with dementia that exhibited high functional impairment and then also a high level of behavioral challenges. Okay, yet they indicated their stress was low. And then we compared them to what we considered a low resilience group. These were people who indicated high stress, but yet were caring for loved ones who didn't necessarily exhibit a high degree of care demand. And when we actually compared these two groups, you know, we classified them at baseline. Over a 3-year period, what we found is that those individuals in the low resilience group, even though their loved ones didn't have as extensive functional impairments or behavioral issues, they were much more likely to basically admit their loved ones into a residential care setting. And then also more likely to drop out of the study too. So again, what that's telling you is that there might be some traction in determining and using something like resilience to target the types of services, supports, interventions that we develop for people living with dementia and their caregivers as well. I think this is a great area of research that needs more attention. And again, the more I think about it, the more I would like to move into this area as well, or back to this area, to be clear. So you heard me talk about this a little bit with Cheryl, in that in the UK and Europe, there's been a lot more work in trying to flesh out this idea of how do we understand well-being and health in people living with dementia. That's extended to terminology. You'll see in a little bit, it's also extended to how research is actually done for and with people living with dementia and their carers in the UK and Europe. But there were a couple of major reports that came out in the past several years where, first, this JPND, the Joint Program Neurodegenerative Disease Research, it included researchers from throughout at the time, well, there still is the European Union, and also researchers from the UK at the time. And really, the main points from this report were as follows. The first is, again, measurement needs to better reflect what is really most reflective of well-being for people living with dementia. The need to avoid using negative terms like cognitive impairment, again, behavioral problems, burden, and then really focusing more on concepts that reflect resilience, strengths-based approaches and strategies to dementia. How do we build self-efficacy and control? Control came up again, didn't it, with our conversation with Cheryl. How do we better measure that in our projects, in our interventions, in our research, and track how that changes? How can that be enhanced and improved? So again, these are some of the main recommendations that came out of this report, and I wanted to emphasize this. This is a real paradigm shift in how we think of dementia and how we do research in living with people with dementia. One of the problems in science is, we often are incentivized to not really move in ways that shift paradigms, quite frankly. So a good example is measurement. Measurement is very important in any kind of research, particularly research that is empirical in nature, because, we want to ensure the measures we use have been validated, that they work, that they're consistent. Unfortunately, many of these newer measures that focus on more positive assessments of dementia haven't been validated in the classic sense, or haven't been used as widely. And because of that, if, for example, say I tried to put in a grant proposal including some of these newer types of measures, some reviewers might look askance at that, because again, that's not what they would expect. And again, getting back to this idea of resilience, another approach that we could use that would probably have more immediate benefit would be to actually take a look at maybe even existing studies that have been going on for some time, which again, maybe have taken a more classic approach as to what is predicting stress, what is predicting negative outcomes in people with dementia and their caregivers. But then try to see, can we categorize and classify those resilient individuals and get a better sense of who are people that are more likely to be resilient? Are they utilizing certain skills, certain tools, certain resources that allows them to be more resilient? And what can we do to promote that? Or also, on the flip side, how can we identify people that are potentially at low resilience, maybe more at risk for negative outcomes, and how can we, again, target resources and services to that particular subgroup? Okay. A couple other European advances I thought were important to note. This social health task force of Interdem, again, it was an international effort, really located in Europe. And what they tried to do was synthesize recent efforts to better understand well-being and dementia. And they also included a pretty robust, if I recall, stakeholder engagement component to this. And they really came up with a new definition of social health and have recommended that this be a key outcome moving ahead when we try to better understand the experience of dementia, the experience of caring for someone with dementia. And social health is the degree to which an individual is able to participate in social life. Again, I keep going back to the conversation with Cheryl because it's such an important influence and validation for what we're talking about here. So again, really emphasizing the dynamic nature of health and the potential to experience fulfillment despite chronic health concerns, okay? There are really three main aspects of social health: functioning in a way that maximizes one's abilities. Again, the strength-based perspective. 2 is maintaining autonomy and coping effectively with the consequences of dementia. I mean, I would argue Cheryl has done that wonderfully. And then finally, engaging in meaningful social activities and relationships. These, again, are the main areas of social health. And when we think of resources and supports, the argument of interdem at least, and I would tend to concur, is building around these areas. Okay. You know, one of the things that I had mentioned earlier was this infrastructure that's been developed in the UK in particular to ensure that people living with dementia and their caregivers' voices are included or at least reflected in research, or at least these stakeholders have a chance to weigh in on research that's conducted. And this is actually called patient public involvement in the UK, or PPI. And from my understanding, what's been done in the UK is really fascinating. We don't really have quite the same infrastructure here in the US. I mean, it might be happening piecemeal at some places, but where essentially, if I was a researcher and I wanted to conduct a study, let's say on caregiving or people living with dementia, you would go through this detailed step-by-step PPI process where you would engage at each step of the research process with people living with dementia and caregivers to refine your questions, to think about and maybe even have them weigh in and review a grant proposal if I was seeking funding to do a study, all the way to the point where even including people living with dementia and their caregivers in aspects of the research process, in conducting interviews, in interpreting data, in writing papers or other dissemination efforts based on that research study. Very, very interesting. I mean, again, in the US, there are institutions and others that have taken steps to build in this kind of structure for their own work. But in the UK, it's been more, if not institutionalized, it's been kind of more commonly accepted, which is fascinating to me. And again, might provide a model for us here to consider in the US. I'm going to stop here for a second to see if we have any questions that have come through. And I don't think we have gotten any questions for my talk here. Have we gotten any new ones, Kate? So that's fine. I need a drink of water anyway. But again, this idea of patient public involvement, and again, the structure that it could provide to ensure that input is collected from key stakeholders throughout the research process. Now, oftentimes, this is an example of PPI in action. This was for a study. It's called the Pride study in the UK, and it's really designed to enhance, if I recall, feelings of confidence and mastery amongst, I think, people living with dementia and their caregivers. I don't know the exact details of the study, but this just shows an example of PPI in action and how, again, stakeholders, I use the term stakeholders, you know, again, people living with dementia and caregivers are engaged at each step of the process. You heard an example, I mean, we don't call it PPI, but we call it community engaged research. You heard an example of this in the African Memory Loss Project. I mean, we were very deliberate, Dr. Kimbang and I, when we began this process and working with Winfred Russell and the African Career Education Resource Incorporated. When we worked with that nonprofit organization, we really wanted to make clear that this was a co-created project. We had an idea in mind in that we wanted to focus on dementia. We wanted to assess both needs as well as existing resources in the African community here in the Twin Cities. But that was kind of it. We had a somewhat of an idea of a research design in mind, but before we proceeded any further, we developed and put in place a very robust project advisory board of around 15 to 20 people from the community, where we kind of went step by step through, here's what we're planning to do, what do you think, what needs to be modified, taking a look at our surveys and questions we were asking. Is this language right? Do we need to modify it? Should we be asking different things? And I think in the end, it ends up creating a research project, a research deliverable that is much more relevant to, again, this idea of the lived experience of people with dementia, their caregivers, and others in given communities. I'm not going to go through this much. Now, you know, oftentimes what happens, sometimes in international research, both from the US and then from other places, is that they will label certain types of research, and it almost sounds like it's a new thing, when in fact, there have been parallel developments in other countries that are very similar. And, you know, when I hear the term PPI, what I think of is what's called community-based participatory research here in the US. And it's a very similar structure and process. I mean, I'm just putting up this figure more for illustrative purposes. We don't necessarily have to go through it in depth. But again, I mean, this is the idea of, at every step of the research process, engaging with the people you would like to conduct research with to ensure that their voices are heard in every aspect of the research process. It's a lot easier said than done, quite frankly, and it's a very different way of doing work. It's a much more time-consuming way of doing work. You know, the traditional way oftentimes when we're engaging with communities is, hey, I have a study I'd like to do with you. Would you mind volunteering for it? And then you get run through the consent process, you do the study, and then quite frankly, you never hear from the researchers again. This framework was done in direct response to that to ensure that the community is part of every step of the research process, including the dissemination process. And we've tried to incorporate that in our own work through the Families and Long-Term Care projects, where many of you, I'm sure, that are attending here today have been kind enough, and we're so grateful for it, to be part of some of our research projects. And, you know, one of the things we do is anytime we conduct research and write it up or get a paper out or do presentation, we try to share that with those participants in the study. And for our larger scale studies, we'll actually even do webinars where we bring all the participants back and they can hear firsthand and ask questions about some of our findings. We're going to be planning on doing that. For example, for those of you that recall, we finished our remote activity monitoring study. For many years, we were trying to recruit people at this conference to be part of that project. And we're actually writing up the final outcome papers. And by the end of the summer, we hope to have a similar event where we have participants from that study, you know, come attend a webinar where they can hear about some of the findings from us. You know, the Alzheimer's Association, and I've been lucky enough to be part of this effort. They have really been attempting to reframe how we measure well-being in Alzheimer's disease. And this is how they see it, this person-centered focus that can be achieved if we effectively measure each of the spokes on that wheel there. And much of this work is happening through an initiative called Link AD, leveraging an interdisciplinary consortium to improve care and outcomes for persons living with Alzheimer's and dementia. This paper that this talk was based upon was actually an introductory paper of a special issue where each paper in the issue is going to look at each one of these domains to more or less lay out an agenda for how can we improve measurement and assessment in these different areas to achieve what's in the center of that circle. Actual, true, person-centered care. Care that is based around the preferences, needs, and values of the person living with dementia and by extension their caregivers, versus outcomes that are externally imposed upon by a quote-unquote expert, like a scientist such as myself. So that's kind of where things are moving in this space of driving the science forward, acknowledging the voices of people living with dementia. So, you know, I'm going to leave this up here as a closing slide, but I have time to address questions here if we have some. And I don't think we have any. Anyone have any questions? Are there some, Kate? You're going to add some in? Great. So again, what's happening is Kate sees the questions on Zoom, and then she puts them in a little document here I can read on my phone. So, but I'll wait here for a minute or so for any questions. No questions, Kate? There are questions? Okay. I don't see it coming up here. Let me refresh. Maybe that's what I have to do. My apologies, everybody. But, you know, while I'm waiting here, I don't know if I have any other thoughts related to that. Kate, I'm sorry. I had a problem with my document. It wasn't coming up, but let me try to track it down again. Kate, did you send me the Google Doc, or was that Robin? Okay. You know, if someone can just shout at me the question, I can try to answer it too. I don't want to keep people stuck here on Zoom. My apologies, everyone. As you can tell, this is not our normal approach to doing this presentation, and I can't find the document. All right. It was working before. I don't know why it's not. What is it? Yeah, okay, sounds good. Thanks, Kate. All right, so Kate was nice enough to give me the laptop with questions, and I will answer the questions here. So one question we have here, it looks like, so important to have an advisory group before you do the research, like the past one that had questions that we could not give correct answers to, like how many times do caregivers attend a support group? and twice a month was not an option, nor could we bypass. Were several other questions that appeared to ignore the people who would be answering those questions. I think what this attendee is getting at, and again, it's a really good point, is, you know, if you don't incorporate the voices of people living with dementia and their caregivers into how you construct measures, questions, items, etc., you really run the risk of not capturing all the necessary information. That's why this structure of, again, whether you want to call it patient-public involvement, community-based, or community-engaged research is so important. James asked, what are you presenting next year? I don't know if I'm going to be presenting next year at the conference. Haven't thought about certain topics. We have some ideas in mind, but one thing I would recommend for those of you who are attending, on the evaluation form, we solicit your input in terms of what topics would you like to hear from us, and then we take that into consideration when we put the agenda together next year. So please definitely think about providing us with that feedback. In terms of my own next presentation, again, I'll remind all of you, on June 29th at 1 o'clock, we're going to be doing a very exciting dementia Q&A panel that's going to include multiple professionals, experts in dementia care provision. It's basically going to be like having your own interdisciplinary geriatric care clinic at your fingertips. And we encourage you to attend and ask questions that you would like answered about dementia, and this group will answer them for you. Paula Beaver, hey Paula, glad you're here. What use can be made of this information as far as assisted living residences are concerned, family caregivers? You know, that's a good question, Paula. I mean, it would depend on the question you're posing around assisted living. You know, one thing we heard, for example, this morning from Dr. Moon is this policy move to kind of recertify assisted living settings in Minnesota. And, you know, there's a push and there's a date set where these assisted living providers have to, you know, do certain things and provide certain information in order to be licensed again, from my understanding. And, you know, from a stakeholder engaged standpoint, from a community standpoint, are we missing certain assisted living providers who maybe don't have the ability or capacity for whatever reason to go through this new process? I'm thinking of assisted living settings that maybe serve traditionally underserved communities. I mean, how is this impacting them? Incorporating the voices of these stakeholders would be very important. And again, this isn't really a research question. I mean, I was talking more about science here, but that's a good example of, you know, if we don't necessarily incorporate stakeholder voices, we can lose key perspectives. And that would be an example in assisted living I can think of. My mother is 98 and has dementia. I've watched the progression over the years. How do you study dementia when dementia extends from undiagnosed memory loss through end of life? Needs are so different. I think the way you study it is you study it over time. When you talk about lived experiences of people with dementia, I think what one has to capture is the full story. The story of how dementia potentially evolves differently for each person, and how the care context may change over time for each person. And too often, if we relegate our research to snapshots in time, what are called cross-sectional studies, we miss that complexity. Is the interest in gero growing more students? So this was a question. So I think someone is asking about, here at the University of Minnesota, is there interest in gerontology, and is it growing? So I'm really glad you brought that up. So at the Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation, which we just relaunched this past year, we actually also relaunched as part of the center the interdisciplinary graduate minor in gerontology. So students now at the university can get a formal minor in gerontology. And we are just relaunching it for this fall. Dr. Tatiana Shippey in the School of Public Health and I just recently concluded a Public Health Institute summer class that was an overview of gerontology, and we had a really good turnout of students. Around 18 students attended. It was an exciting format too, because the institute format, it gives students could earn credit or credits for the class, but it was an intensive week-long course in gerontology. And our sense was that was really appealing to many students who maybe couldn't fit classic courses during the fall and spring semesters in their course schedule. So we're thinking of really opening up and opening our minds in terms of how we deliver courses in gerontology to meet the needs of students. And we're very enthusiastic about the potential for growth in gerontology. We do have an aging studies interdisciplinary graduate group as part of our Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation, and that's been very popular. There are probably, I think there's over 70 students as part of that group. They meet monthly, they'll have networking events, they'll bring in speakers, and that to me is very encouraging in terms of students and student interest in gerontology at the university. So another question, beds for memory care seem to be cutting down because of the new laws in August, as are staffing levels. So less beds, and where do the residents go? That's a great question, and I don't know. You know, when policy changes such as this one, for example, the assisted living, you know, policy goes into effect, sometimes I wonder, do we take into account the full possible ramifications of that policy? Again, we're kind of going a little bit different than my talk, which was focusing on scientific research. But that being said, stakeholder engagement is just as important, if not more so, in policies and how policies are enacted and what the potential impacts are. And one is concerned if, you know, say some of these settings are no longer certified or licensed, yet they are serving people definitely in need, and particularly in need in certain communities. I mean, these are just questions. I don't know the answer to these. I don't even know if I have an opinion necessarily, but these are questions I would like to know about, particularly if you see a big drop off in the number of assisted living settings that were licensed / certified. Again, I don't know if I'm using the right terms, before the policy and after. If there's a big drop off, I wonder about that. Okay. Is there specific assisted living or nursing homes in Minnesota for specific immigrant communities serving people whose first language is not English from, I guess, not non-Western traditions? Yes, they do exist. You know, in terms of how they're promoted, where they are, that's less clear to me. You can go on, I think, the Minnesota Department of Health website. You can get a listing of all the assisted living settings that are certified in Minnesota. And you can get some, you know, really basic information of, like, say, who maybe the administrator is, the address, the phone number. But beyond that, you don't get a lot of in-depth detail about, for example, you know, do they actually provide services such as care for individuals who are not English speaking? That's a great question, and I don't think that information is widely available, although you could make the argument it should be. So. A lot of informal ones. Yeah, that's right, Cheryl. And we've come across some of those certainly in the Somali community. So yeah, I mean, they're out there. Again, what I'm worried about is policies such as what we heard about this morning. How will that affect them? Okay. I think those are all the questions, and we're coming out at the end of time. And again, I apologize for me not being as facile with the technology and the phone and the questions, but I think I was able to address all the questions here. Really appreciate all the great comments. Again, I thank Cheryl so much. I mean, that really meant so much to me. I know it meant a lot to all of you in the audience. We so appreciate it. And I think that will conclude my presentation. So we have a 15-minute break, right, everybody? And we'll reconvene at 2:45 for our final presentation. Today, a great panel on art and dementia, which is always great. I can't wait to see it. And again, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.